Daniel Hartwell executed 4 members of his extended family in their suburban home on Indianapolis's northwest side, methodically eliminating each victim with a single fatal strike. The victims included his sister-in-law Alexandra Chen, his estranged brother-in-law Gregory Chen, his professional rival and neighbor Donald Vickers, and Vickers's adult daughter Stephanie. The bodies were discovered 3 days later when neighbors grew concerned about an uncollected newspaper and the absence of mourning activity. What had begun as a professional dispute and custody conflict had escalated into one of the most calculated family annihilations in Indianapolis's modern history. Before proceeding with this shocking case, we want to acknowledge the gravity of these crimes and the profound loss experienced by the victims' families. Please subscribe to ensure we continue bringing these important investigations to light, allowing victim advocacy groups and law enforcement to share their expertise. Your support helps us maintain rigorous journalistic standards while honoring the memory of those lost to violence. Daniel Hartwell's life had been defined by meticulous planning and careful calculation. A successful commercial contractor with a reputation for precision, Hartwell had built his career in Indianapolis's competitive construction industry over 20 years. At 52 years old, he maintained the outward appearance of stability, a comfortable home in the Westridge neighborhood, a profitable business, and connections throughout the community through his church and civic organizations. The unraveling began 18 months before the murders, when Hartwell's wife of 28 years, Victoria, filed for divorce. The split, initially civil, became acrimonious during negotiations over their substantial assets and custody arrangements for their teenage son. Victoria had sought refuge with her brother Gregory Chen and his wife Alexandra, both accomplished professionals in the healthcare industry. The Chens had welcomed their sister's family into their home, a decision that Hartwell came to view as a coalition against him. Professional complications compounded personal turmoil. Donald Vickers, a real estate developer who had become Hartwell's neighbor in Westridge 3 years prior, had undercut Hartwell on multiple lucrative contracts. Vickers operated with an aggressive business model that prioritized rapid profit over quality, and he had successfully leveraged local relationships to win projects Hartwell had invested significant time pursuing. Between the divorce and business losses, Hartwell's financial situation had deteriorated more than publicly acknowledged. He owed substantial sums on construction equipment and had begun deferring payments to subcontractors. The stress manifested in behavioral changes that concerned those close to him. Hartwell's employees reported his increasing irritability and tendency to fixate on perceived slights. He began documenting every business interaction with Vickers, maintaining detailed records of what he considered unfair competition. At church, where he had served as a treasurer, fellow members noticed his sermons had become darker, his perspectives more paranoid. The planning. What emerged during investigation was evidence of systematic preparation spanning nearly 4 months. Detective Sergeant Maria Gonzalez would later describe Hartwell's methodology as frighteningly bureaucratic in its approach. Hartwell had researched the layout of the Chen residence through property records, drove past their home repeatedly, and documented their daily routines through observation notebooks found in his apartment. He had purchased tools specifically suited to the crime from multiple retailers across 3 states, paying cash to avoid clear purchasing patterns. Hartwell had also studied traffic patterns in the Westridge neighborhood, identifying optimal routes for approaching and leaving the Chen's residence while minimizing exposure to surveillance cameras. He had even researched poison dosages, though ultimately abandoned that approach in favor of a method he deemed more controllable. Most disturbingly, Hartwell maintained a digital record of his intentions through encrypted files on his personal computer. These files, discovered by cybercrime specialists, contained dated entries spanning 4 months. One entry, written 2 weeks before the murders, read, "The system that destroyed my family will understand the cost of their treachery. V's brother thinks he can protect her. D thinks his money buys him immunity from consequences. None of them understand what's coming." Hartwell had even created a document he titled Collateral Damage Assessment, which listed 9 individuals he identified as complicit in his downfall, ranking them by priority. The Chen siblings occupied the top positions, followed by Vickers and his immediate family. The document contained notes about each person's vulnerabilities and daily patterns. Vickers's daughter Stephanie appeared on the list not because of direct wrongdoing, but because Hartwell had calculated that her death would maximize Vickers's suffering. The night. September 15th began as an ordinary Tuesday in the Westridge neighborhood. Gregory and Alexandra Chen had hosted a small dinner party that evening, attended by friends from their medical practice. The guests departed around 11 p.m., leaving the household in a state of relaxed evening routine. At approximately 12:47 a.m., Hartwell, who had positioned himself in the neighborhood several hours earlier, approached the Chen residence through the backyard. He had previously disabled a section of the property's perimeter fence, allowing silent entry. Hartwell carried a small electronic device he had constructed himself, a sophisticated tool for bypassing modern residential security systems. He had researched the specific model the Chens used and spent weeks studying similar installations through video tutorials. The security system, disarmed without triggering an alarm, revealed to investigators the level of preparation. Hartwell had even timed his approach to correspond with the security system's monthly scheduled maintenance cycle, when the monitoring service performed routine checks that would mask unusual activity. What happened inside the residence remained partially unknown, pieced together only through forensic evidence and digital reconstructions. Alexander Chen was discovered in the master bedroom, struck with such force that initial speculation centered on blunt force trauma until the medical examiner identified the true cause. Gregory Chen was found in the downstairs study, evidence suggesting he had attempted to fight back before being overwhelmed. Alexandra's body lay in the kitchen, suggesting she may have been trying to escape or reach a phone. Stephanie Vickers, who had been staying overnight while her apartment underwent renovations, was discovered in the guest bedroom. Hartwell had not attempted to conceal this death with the same precision as the others, perhaps because once his primary targets were eliminated, urgency had diminished, or perhaps because he recognized that his carefully constructed life was already obliterated. The discovery. The bodies were discovered not through any single event, but through accumulating inconsistencies. When Gregory Chen failed to appear for a scheduled surgery on September 18, a violation of his 30-year professional record, his surgical department initiated contact attempts. Calls went unanswered. By evening, the medical practice had contacted police for a welfare check. Officers Jamal Washington and Sarah Peterman arrived at the residence at 7:34 p.m., noting immediately that something was wrong. The house appeared sealed, newspapers piled on the front step, and the garage door remained closed. A window visible from the driveway showed curtains drawn in complete darkness despite the early evening hour. After receiving permission from a neighbor who possessed spare keys for emergencies, the officers entered. The scene that confronted them was almost clinical in its precision. There was remarkably little blood spattered despite the violent nature of the attacks. Hartwell had planned for this as well, using materials to contain fluid evidence and methodically cleaning specific areas. Detective Maria Gonzalez arrived at 8:12 p.m., called to what had immediately been classified as a multiple homicide. Gonzalez, a 15-year veteran of homicide investigation, noted several unusual aspects. The bodies had been arranged carefully rather than left in positions of random violence, there were no signs of sexual assault or robbery, and nothing appeared disturbed or ransacked. The crime scene suggested someone who had been cold and methodical, who had known their victims, and who had not acted in the heat of passion. The investigation unfolds. Gonzalez's first instinct was to investigate the victims' recent conflicts and relationships. She began with Gregory and Alexandra Chen's professional lives, examining whether anyone at their medical practice harbored resentment. The investigation broadened to include their personal relationships, their involvement in civic organizations, and their interactions within the Westridge community. The connection to Daniel Hartwell emerged through a secondary avenue. A neighbor, Thomas Lee, reported that he had observed Hartwell on multiple occasions driving slowly past the Chen residence over the previous months. Lee had considered it strange enough to note but not urgent enough to report until Hartwell became the obvious suspect. Once identified, surveillance footage from multiple sources, traffic cameras, home security systems, parking lot cameras, confirmed Hartwell's presence in the neighborhood on the night of the murders. Traffic camera footage placed Hartwell's silver Lexus sedan within 6 blocks of the Chen residence at 12:32 a.m. on September 15. Another camera captured what appeared to be the same vehicle at 2:47 a.m., traveling in the opposite direction at an unusual speed. ATM footage showed Hartwell withdrawing $8,000 in cash from his business account at 1:15 a.m., a withdrawal that would prove significant when investigators discovered it. The murder weapon, or rather, weapons, took longer to identify. Initial speculation centered on blunt force trauma, but the medical examiner's detailed autopsy revealed something more complex. Multiple types of injury were present, suggesting the perpetrator had used implements specifically suited to each victim. This variability suggested someone implementing a detailed plan that had accounted for different scenarios. The digital evidence. The breakthrough came through examination of Hartwell's digital devices. His personal computer, seized from his apartment, contained encrypted files that cybercrime specialists managed to access within 72 hours. Inside were the detailed planning documents, the encrypted journals, the research files on security systems, and the collateral damage assessment. More immediately useful was Hartwell's cell phone location data, which showed a clear gap in his signal pings from 12:15 a.m. to 2:52 a.m. on September 15, precisely the window when investigators believed the murders occurred. Hartwell had deliberately turned off his phone during the critical time frame, creating a suspicious digital silence during the time he could not account for his movements. Email records revealed communication with various contractors and dark web contacts, including correspondence about acquiring specialized tools. One message, sent 6 weeks before the murders, read, "Looking for professional quality implements. Don't ask questions, don't keep records. Need reliable, durable items suitable for demolition work." The recipient, an anonymous seller on an encrypted platform, had provided what appeared to be a toolkit description. When police obtained a search warrant for Hartwell's storage unit, a facility he maintained under a false name, they discovered materials that corroborated premeditation. The storage unit contained the planning notes, more detailed sketches of the Chen residence layout, photographs of neighborhood security camera locations, and purchase receipts for equipment paid in cash. Building the case. Detective Gonzalez's team worked methodically to establish timeline and motive. They examined Hartwell's divorce proceedings, discovering that the settlement negotiations had reached an impasse precisely 2 months before the murders. Victoria Hartwell had been awarded primary custody of their son and 55% of marital assets, a decision that cost Daniel Hartwell approximately $1.8 million. Gregory Chen had testified in the custody hearing, providing information about Hartwell's emotional instability and inappropriate behavior toward their son during visits. Alexandra had provided character statements supporting Victoria's account. This testimony had directly influenced the judge's decision, in Hartwell's perception making them responsible for the financial devastation that followed. The professional dimension was equally important. Hartwell's business was in severe financial distress, with outstanding debts exceeding $2.1 million. 3 major projects he had bid on had been awarded to Vickers's firm, resulting in missed income that prevented timely debt repayment. Hartwell had been facing potential bankruptcy, the loss of his business license, and potential criminal charges for fraud related to contractor licensing violations. Investigators discovered that Hartwell had been collecting intelligence on Vickers for months. He had hired a private investigator, a relationship the PI's company revealed under subpoena, to monitor Vickers's business activities, personal movements, and family routines. The investigators' reports, which should have simply documented business activities, became evidence of Hartwell's obsessive focus. The arrest. Daniel Hartwell was arrested at his office on September 20, 5 days after the murders were discovered. He had attempted no escape, maintained his normal business routine, and had not fled despite multiple opportunities to do so. Gonzalez later theorized that Hartwell had already begun the transition to viewing himself as a victim of his own actions, a casualty of systems he perceived as unjust rather than a perpetrator of calculated homicide. Hartwell's demeanor during arrest was notable for its composure. He offered no resistance when tactical officers entered his office, made no statements, and complied fully with all procedures. He accepted the right to counsel and declined voluntary questioning, a choice that frustrated investigators but proved ultimately inconsequential given the overwhelming evidence. During interrogation, conducted over 8 hours despite Hartwell's attorney's objections to its length, Hartwell made only 3 substantive statements. When confronted with the encrypted files from his computer, he responded, "A man has the right to think about his circumstances." When presented with evidence of his surveillance of the Chin residence, he stated, "I was documenting the community. It's not a crime to observe your neighborhood." When shown the collateral damage assessment, he responded, "People write things they don't act on." However, in a moment of apparent emotional rupture approximately 6 hours into the interrogation, when investigators played recordings of interview statements made by Victoria Hartwell, who described her ex-husband's threats and frightening statements, Hartwell's composure fractured. "She should have protected our son," he said quietly. "She should have simply taken the settlement I offered privately and left the courts out of it. They forced my hand. They left me no alternative." This statement, recorded and documented, fell just short of confession but provided prosecutors with evidence of consciousness of guilt and implied threat motivation. The trial preparation. Wayne County Prosecutor James Hartford, a veteran prosecutor with a conviction rate exceeding 92% in violent felony cases, reviewed the evidence with satisfaction tinged by the unusual nature of the case. The evidence was comprehensive but not overwhelming in the way prosecutors typically prefer. There was no eyewitness who had observed Hartwell at the scene. There was no weapon recovered with his fingerprints. There was no forensic evidence definitively linking Hartwell to the crime scene. What Hartford had instead was motive, opportunity, detailed planning evidence, and suspicious gaps in Hartwell's account of his movements. The digital evidence was substantial but not incontrovertible. A skilled defense attorney could potentially argue that encrypted journals represented fantasy rather than intention, that online research could indicate academic interest rather than criminal planning. Hartford decided early that this case would require presenting a narrative that was compelling, thorough, and circumstantial in its comprehensiveness. He would not rely on any single piece of evidence but would instead construct a mosaic of detail that, examined together, pointed unmistakably toward Hartwell's guilt. Defense attorney Margaret Sullivan, known for her aggressive representation of high-profile defendants, accepted Hartwell's case using funds from his business assets and a contribution from his aging parents. Sullivan recognized immediately that her client faced nearly insurmountable challenges. She began preparing a strategy that would focus on raising reasonable doubt rather than asserting innocence. The trial begins. The Marion County Courthouse resembled a media circus in the weeks leading up to the trial. Indianapolis news outlets had given the case extensive coverage, with particular attention paid to the seemingly ordinary man who had allegedly murdered his former in-laws and their guest. The narrative of professional failure spiraling into family violence had resonated with local audiences, and the trial was expected to be highly publicized. Judge Patricia Whitmore, a jurist known for her meticulous management of trials and zero tolerance for courtroom disruption, presided. She ruled immediately on pretrial motions, determining that the digital evidence would be admissible as it met standards for authentication and relevance. This decision represented a significant victory for the prosecution. Jury selection consumed 4 days and examined over 140 potential jurors before 12 members and 3 alternates were seated. The panel was diverse in both demographics and experience, with several members possessing professional backgrounds that could translate technical testimony into understandable concepts. Prosecutor Hartford's opening statement framed the case directly. On September 15 of this year, Daniel Hartwell systematically murdered 4 people who represented obstacles to his financial security and emotional stability. What you will hear is not a case of passion or accident, but of premeditated violence resulting from careful planning and obsessive preparation. The evidence will show that Daniel Hartwell conducted surveillance, researched methods, documented his intentions, and then executed a plan that cost 4 innocent people their lives. Defense attorney Sullivan's opening was more measured. The state will present circumstantial evidence suggesting my client's guilt. But circumstantial evidence, by definition, requires interpretation. It requires assumptions. It requires you to connect dots that may not be as clearly connected as prosecutors suggest. My client was a man facing significant personal and professional challenges. His thinking may have become disordered. His judgment may have been compromised. But facing difficult circumstances is not the same as committing murder. The evidence in this case falls tragically short of proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The evidence presented. Prosecutor Hartford called Detective Maria Gonzalez as his first witness. Gonzalez walked the jury through the investigation with precision, detailing the crime scene, the evidence recovery process, and the timeline established through various data sources. She described finding Hartwell in a calm state at his office, his business functioning normally despite the recent murders, his apparent lack of distress or concern about the victims. The digital forensics expert, Dr. Raymond Okonkwo, provided technical testimony about the encrypted files recovered from Hartwell's computer. His presentation included displays of the planning documents, the dated journal entries, the collateral damage assessment, and the research into security system vulnerabilities. Dr. Okonkwo testified that the files showed evidence of careful planning over an extended period, refuting any suggestion of impulsive action. Financial expert Patricia Walsh testified about Hartwell's deteriorating economic situation. She presented evidence of his business debt, failed bids, missed payments to subcontractors, and the settlement amounts from the divorce proceeding. Walsh demonstrated that Hartwell's financial position in September was dire enough that bankruptcy appeared imminent. Victoria Hartwell testified about her ex-husband's threatening statements in the months before the murders. She described statements he had made about settling accounts with her family and references to making them understand the cost of their betrayal. She testified that Hartwell had explicitly stated that Gregory Chen had poisoned her against him during the custody proceedings. Surveillance specialist Derek Paulson presented hours of footage and traffic camera data showing Hartwell's movements on September 15. Paulson traced Hartwell's vehicle from his residence, through the Westridge neighborhood, near the Chen household, and returning to his residence. The timeline presented matched almost perfectly with the estimated time of death. Medical examiner Dr. Kenneth Foster provided clinical but powerful testimony about the cause of death for each victim. His testimony was deliberately unemotional and clinical, focusing on the evidence rather than the tragedy. Foster described wound patterns, the sequence of injuries, and his professional assessment that all 4 murders had been committed by someone with knowledge of anatomy and deliberate intention to cause specific types of fatal injury. The defense response. Defense attorney Sullivan focused her cross-examination on challenging the certainty of the state's timeline and emphasizing the circumstantial nature of the physical evidence. She highlighted the absence of forensic evidence directly linking Hartwell to the crime scene, no fingerprints, no DNA, no fibers that could not be explained by innocent contact. Sullivan called a cybersecurity expert who testified that encrypted files could be interpreted in multiple ways and that detailed planning documents might represent obsessive fantasy processing rather than intention to act. The expert testified that many individuals engaged in similar documentation of grievances without ever committing violence. Sullivan called a forensic psychiatrist who testified that Hartwell's behavior was consistent with obsessive personality disorder rather than psychopathy or sociopathy. The psychiatrist suggested that Hartwell's detailed planning could reflect a disordered thinking pattern in which he processed his anxiety through planning without forming true intention. However, Sullivan's defense strategy suffered when she called Daniel Hartwell himself to testify. Hartwell's testimony was disastrous for the defense. When questioned about the collateral damage assessment, he became evasive and contradictory. When confronted about his surveillance of the Chen residence, he initially denied it before acknowledging periodic observation of the neighborhood. When shown the encrypted message about acquiring specialized tools, Hartwell's explanation that he had been considering a renovation project became clearly implausible under Hartford's aggressive cross-examination. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 13 hours over 2 days. Their return to the courtroom carried the tension characteristic of high-stakes criminal proceedings. Judge Whitmore ordered complete silence as the verdict forms were delivered and read. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Gregory Chen, the verdict was guilty. The same verdict was returned for Alexandra Chen, Stephanie Vickers, and a fourth count related to Don Vickers, who had survived the initial attack but died from his injuries 2 weeks later in the hospital, a death that elevated the case from 4 murders to 5. Hartwell received the guilty verdicts with no visible reaction. His attorney placed a supportive hand briefly on his shoulder, and the two conferred quietly at the defense table. The sentencing hearing occurred 3 weeks later. Prosecutor Hartford presented evidence of aggravating factors, the premeditation, the multiple victims, the deliberate planning, and the complete lack of remorse. Victoria Hartwell testified about the impact on her son, who now carried not only the knowledge that his father had committed mass murder but also that his extended family had been among the victims. Judge Whitmore sentenced Hartwell to 5 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. In her sentencing remarks, she noted, "Mr. Hartwell, you have demonstrated throughout these proceedings an inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of your own decisions. Instead of confronting your failures in business and marriage, you chose to blame others and to plan their destruction. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in confinement, where you will have unlimited opportunity to reflect on your actions. That reflection, I suspect, you will find profoundly unsatisfying." The aftermath. The community of Westridge, defined by its middle-class stability and safety, struggled to process the revelation that premeditated mass murder had occurred in their neighborhood. The Chen residence was eventually sold to a family from outside the area who attempted to remove the psychological weight of its history by extensive renovations. Victoria Hartwell, assisted by Victims Advocate Services, worked to rebuild her life and support her son's recovery. She established a scholarship fund in the names of her brother and sister-in-law, directing resources to medical students from disadvantaged backgrounds. Indianapolis law enforcement implemented enhanced threat assessment protocols in family court proceedings. Following the Hartwell case, courts began mandating threat evaluation for cases involving significant financial disputes and custody conflicts, particularly when high-conflict behavior had been documented. Detective Maria Gonzalez, interviewed a year after the conviction, reflected on the case. "What disturbed me most was how ordinary he appeared. He maintained his business, attended church, paid his bills, until the moment he didn't. He carefully constructed a life that appeared normal while secretly planning violence. It's a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are those who appear entirely unremarkable." Daniel Hartwell remained at Indiana State Prison North, where he maintained a quiet, compliant demeanor. He participated in educational programs, worked in the prison maintenance department, and made no apparent adjustment difficulties. Former correctional officers described him as eerily calm, a man who seemed entirely disconnected from the magnitude of his crimes or the lives he had destroyed.